everyone, welcome. Welcome back everyone to the Whitler Hall for our final plenary session. We'd just like to make a couple of final announcements before we get on with the next part. Do I keep going? So, our imminent and highly anticipated final plenary session is going to be live streamed, so do make sure that you tell all of the Vera fans in your life that they haven't missed out on the hottest ticket in town. They can catch it online, so send them the link. We'd also like to highlight that this is going to be followed by a short closing session, so please do stick around for that to see the end of the conference. I'd also like to highlight that there's been a remarkable tablet that's been lost, and if you've lost it, that probably means more to you than it does to me. But if you have lost a remarkable tablet, then please do find a volunteer who will help get this back to you. And finally, for the last time of the BAAL conference, I'd like to make the health and safety announcement. So in the event of a fire alarm, please exit calmly through your closest exit, which are either here or at the back where you came in. When you're outside the building, please assemble outside the physics building, which is this way towards the car park. Please remain outside in the rain until instructed otherwise by somebody that looks official. Even if the alarm has stopped, we need to make sure that the fire catastrophe is over before we let you back in. So without further ado, I'll hand over and we'll get the plenary session started. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, everyone. My name is Dr. Aisling O'Boyle. I am the Director of the Centre for Language Education Research here at Queen's University Belfast, and absolutely delighted to be introducing Professor Vera Regan today. As many of you already know, Professor Vera Regan is Emeritus Full Professor of Sociolinguistics at the School of Languages, Cultures and Linguistics at University College Dublin. Professor Regan is former chair of the European Association. So Professor Regan is former chair of the European Association for Second Language Research and former chair of the Association of French Language Studies. With research in language spanning over a number of decades, Professor Regan studied at the University of Pennsylvania with William Labov, instrumental, as we all know, in finding work in variationist sociolinguistics. Professor Regan has held 2 Fulbright Research Fellowships and has held visiting fellowships at the University of Ottawa. Latterly, she has been awarded the Chevalier de l'Ordre des Palmes Adamiques, an honour awarded for exceptional services to universities, education and science. If I may, the exceptional service is a term I'd like to focus on here. You and I will be very familiar, and we can read the over 150 publications and research outputs Professor Regan has produced. These include, of course, Variation in the Cambridge Handbook for Second Language Acquisition, Second Language Acquisition and Sociolinguistic Approaches, the Case of French L2, in the Routledge Handbook of SLA and Sociolinguistics, and Variation, Identity and Language Attitudes, Polish Migrants in France, and Variation in Second and Heritage Languages, published by John Benjamin. But that service extends beyond academia to reach out and into the ears and the eyes of a much, much wider population. Professor Regan's TEDx talk, entitled "What Your Speaking Style Like Says About You," and I apologize for the ventriloquism, but it's the only way I could make sense of that being said out loud. It has been viewed over 3.8 million times and has been liked 45,000 plus times. Her regular public engagement on national radio programs to answer questions like, why do we mispronounce English words. Sees her giving explanations that there is inherent variability of language, and it's no big deal. And the wonderful explanation in response to the question, was Lady Gaga's Gucci accent good enough, is preceded by the most beautiful pause I've ever heard. And it reminded me of the kind of pauses that happen when we all get asked those kinds of questions. This engagement and engaging interaction sees Professor Regan bring contemporary knowledge and understandings of linguistics and the importance of linguistics into our homes, into our cars, and our everyday lives. And this is important. It is important for everyone. It is most important for those in positions of vulnerability in our societies. And Professor Regan's talk this morning addresses this very issue of sociolinguistics and inclusion. The linguistic landscapes of this place where we are, as we all know, are shaped by migration, settlement, resettlement, and social change. They have always been diverse, and they continue to change. Traditionally spoken across the region, Ulster Scots and Irish are witnessing growing numbers of young bilingual Gaeilge and growing numbers of people with knowledge of Ulster Scots. Northern Ireland and Ireland resonates and interacts with these languages in distinct varieties of English, sign languages, and language spoken in newly arrived communities. For Professor Regan, through her Government of Ireland Senior Research Fellowship project entitled Language, Identity and Interculturalism in Ireland, funded by the Irish Research Council for the Humanities and Social Sciences, this project uses sociolinguistic models to provide detailed analysis of how both migrant and traditional Irish negotiate and construct identities through language, with the implications for how Irish society manages social and linguistic diversity. But going beyond these shores, Professor Regan examines migrant experiences in France and Ireland to reveal much about both language use and aspirations regarding trajectories of the lives of children and their parents. So it is with our collective pleasure that we welcome Professor Vera Regan, plenary speaker to the 2002 annual BAAL conference here at Queen's University Belfast. Thank you.
Aisling, thank you so very much indeed for making me feel so welcome and for these enormous tributes, which I have to say, I'm having great difficulty connecting with my own work. On the other hand, it describes what I aspire to do and what I think we as applied linguistics, in applied linguistics, really aim to do, which is to include people, to make people feel that the language is okay. And I'm hoping with this paper this morning to take up exactly where you have started so well and set the scene so well for this particular view and enterprise in relation to language. So without further ado, I'd like to thank everybody here for coming, for having the patience to wait. You've been working so hard for at least 2 or 3 days, and I think this is just amazing that you have both the stamina and the patience. So I'm deeply grateful. Thank you. It's a great honor to be here. And my second thanks is due to the committee of BAAL, the British Association for Applied Linguistics, such an important association within the field of linguistics today. I think it's probably never been a more important time for applied linguistics as a field and for this particular association with such a long history and so many distinguished people who've taken part over the years. So again, a huge thank you. I'm very honored and very grateful to be invited. Thank you. Okay, so as Aisling says, this is about, it's about language, it's about communication, and I have to make a small apology before I start in relation to the abstract. The abstract talked a lot about children's language, and what I found was when I was working on this paper, the emphasis moved perhaps a little more towards inclusion and language variation patterns through the words of the parents. So I will present the children. I'm not apologizing for not presenting them. They're there. But their voices are coming through the voices of the parents. And this took a life of its own while I was doing that paper. So while I acknowledge that it may be slightly irritating, and I always feel, oh, why isn't she sticking to the bloomin' abstract that I came to hear? I promise you, there will be lots about kids and the language. The other day I was reading the Irish Times, as I do, increasingly infrequently, because like everybody, I'm reading stuff online, but I did read the Irish Times, and I saw this story about a judge. So my paper is actually going to be about two stories. It's going to be a little story about this judge and her views of language competence and communication, and a longer story about the people she was talking about, who were people who were in her court. They were migrants, and her view was that they shouldn't need interpreters. They'd been in the country for 6 months. What do they bloomin' well need interpreters for? So I was mulling over this, and I was thinking, oh, she isn't giving them much time to learn a language. 6 months, oh, okay, even with the Berlitz school and BAAL or anything else, I'd find it tough going to learn a language in 6 months. And it started me thinking about, what does she understand by communication? What does she understand by communicative competence, which is what I guess we in this group would probably call it. So it appears that there are very different views of this. It's obvious that what the opinion of the migrants wanting the interpreters was quite different from what the judge was. So we've heard the judge's voice, and I feel at this point it's time to listen to the migrant's voice. And that's why I'd like to describe to you today a piece of research I've done where these migrants' voices emerge very loudly and very insistently. And I think we need to respect that, and we need to try and tune in to what people are saying. So I want to talk about their views, not the views of officialdom. So what do we mean by communicative competence? You all have very clear notions of this, so I'm going to be very brief and say it probably goes back to the first use by Del Hymes, who is the father of the term, and who used the term to encounter what was seen at the time as the ideal speaker hero. And anybody, I think most of us hardly remember what that was, but it was a very, very big thing in the mid-20th century. For Hymes, this wasn't accounting for the complexity of communication between people in a social context. So he got busy, started working on it, and came up with this term, communicative competence. And then from a position of the perspective of power relations, later Bourdieu talked about the definition of competence as the right to speak. So this was looking at it from another perspective. He talks about the right to speak, the legitimate language, the authorized language, which is also the language of authority. And competence for Bourdieu implied the power to impose reception, as he put it. Now, since Hymes's work, the term has been rethought in various ways, especially in the light of the focus on multilingual speakers, which wasn't always the case within applied linguistics. And we think immediately of the work of Vivian Cook, Li Wei, of course. Other people followed in their wake, and I think all of us work really with the knowledge that people are multilingual. There are very few monolinguals left. It's like the dodo. So since Hymes's work, the case of the multilingual speaker is understood to be not just a case of two monolingual speakers kind of stuck together in someone's head, but rather it's a case of several languages in constant interaction with each other simultaneously. So you're getting a quite different entity, and all of us here are people who fit that case, I would think. And the ability of us as multilingual speakers to use whatever language resources you have, using bits of your linguistic repertoires according to whatever meaning-making interaction of the moment calls for. And I think we've all known the feeling of having, I do anyway, having a sort of shopping bag, and I kind of reach into the shopping bag to see which language, which bit of a language fits better. And it can be irritating to certain people that, you know, you don't find the right word in the right language according to their notion of right. And this sort of creativity, I feel, is creative. And it's been celebrated by Rampton, Li Wei, Han, and many, many others by now. Cramsch, Claire, says that the term communicative competence has become simplified in the service of instrumental goals related to efficiency and accountability in foreign language education, which I don't think is a bad thing, however. And there's a new volume, a really exciting volume about to come out by Canwit and Solon, and this, I'll put the reference to that at the end in a bibliography that I'll flash up on the screen for you. And their plea is for a fuller definition of communicative competence. And I think that's going to be a really valuable contribution, because it's going to open up a whole lot of avenues in relation to this term, which I think needed to be looked at, and also connections to other areas in the field of linguistics. Solon and Canwit say that determinations of what counts as communicatively competent are often still guided by reductive language ideologies that revert back to constructs, norms such as, and we all are very aware of these, the ideal monolingual speaker, the native speaker, which at one point linguists felt we should all be aiming for if we were looking at second language acquisition. Linguistic prescriptivism, which still hangs around, even though in this community it's not something I think that we wouldn't be sensitive to. And outdated and often racialized notions of appropriateness. Again, I think we're all familiar with this. So, in the same volume, Harding says that how we conceptualize, define, and assess communicative competence is not only a matter of theoretical coherence or methodological rigor, but one of social justice. And he says we must be willing to critically examine this construct in the light of current linguistic and social realities and previous blind spots. So I think that work which is emerging day after day is very competently and very imaginatively dressing these blind spots, and I'm really happy to see that. And in addition, Ortega's notion of needing to continue to expand definitions and notions of communicative competence to recognize, incorporate, and valorize the multilingual and translingual reality of our world and of many communicative situations. And her notions of equitable multilingualism, I think will probably be familiar to us all. I concur with this, and I'm hoping that this paper will align itself with those aims. We need to broaden out our notions, and we need to avoid the long-standing monolingual bias. And we need to accept that the multilingual speakers I'm going to be talking about are not simply deficient native speakers, but they're highly skilled users of several languages, and they have very definite notions of how they feel about language. And this is stuff that emerged from the data, and it emerged unbidden, which is the interesting bit for me. I wasn't actually going looking for it, and I think probably we'll have all had that experience, that we may have started out with one research question in mind, and we may answer that, but other things bubble up at the same time. So what I found was, and I'm going to sort of skip to the end to tell you where I'm going with this, I found that their language attitudes, like other aspects of language competence, were not just lifted wholesale from native speaker attitudes, but instead they were reimagined, rearranged, and used in ways which seem different from those of native speakers. And we kind of know people do that with syntax and phonology, morphology. You know, we kind of mix and match as we use languages which aren't our L1s. But I hadn't actually focused on the fact that we do this also with the attitudes we have, and also perhaps with the attitudes which kind of come with the languages we're learning. And I found that the multilingual migrant speakers we're meeting here seem to be making their own versions of language attitudes and of language ideologies, which they found in the countries they were living in. So I'll be mainly letting them talk for themselves, either by listening to what they say about their feelings about language, and how it relates to their feelings of inclusion and non-inclusion. And that was the bit that I found really compelling. Not only what they say, but then also how they say it. And this is specifically in relation to the variation patterns they use. And in addition, through their voices, I was hearing the voices of their children. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to present them and their views and practices of a group of Polish speakers in France principally, and as Aisling said also briefly in Ireland, because they were two different groups of Polish L1 speakers, and the comparison was kind of interesting, as I hope you'll agree. The accuracy of their views is not in question here. It's not the issue. Strongly held beliefs, whether accurate or not, will have an impact on language practices, behaviors, and long-term social outcomes. And perhaps these language attitudes can complement and inform language policy discussions, and these regarding state interventions and support. And that's really what matters in the Híl of Dhont. I'm just talking today about the voices of the people, but what we would hope ultimately is that these voices will be heard by people who are actually gatekeepers, teachers, researchers, people who make decisions about people's practical lives from day to day. On a wider, more general level, given what they said, a broader theoretical issue emerged, which is the relationship between communicative competence and language attitudes and ideologies, both the fact of and the nature of the relationship. And often these two areas are seen as separate in their space in the literature. So I think it began to occur to me that actually we need to relook at this whole business of language attitudes and language ideologies, and maybe rethink the sort of work that was going on in the 70s, which was really good, starting with Lambert in Canada. But we could really learn from that and maybe rethink it and reimagine it for today. And I think from what I've been hearing, that communicative competence might also include issues around language attitudes and ideologies. Now, as I said, the group of people I was interested in communicating with were migrants. And there's no need to remind any of us that our century, the 21st century, has seen a huge complexification of individuals' life, resulting what has been called different names. So we've heard things like translocality, liquid modernity, global complexity, and especially, I think, one of the ones that we use a lot, superdiversity, Verterek in 2007. Now, Parkin thinks that this is a very good term, but he sees it as descriptive rather than theoretical. And I think that's really good. It's a strong position to start from. He feels that it's powerful to address the complexity of the migrant experience. And this, of course, resulting from stuff like, well, geopolitical events, explosion in technology, social media, all the stuff we know that goes into our lives at the moment. Well, for whatever reasons, we're experiencing mass migration. So what's a migrant? Block calls of migrant people who have moved across geographical boundaries and borders and immersed themselves in new cultural and linguistic environments. Now, today, the barriers are fewer, the opportunities for mobility are less. Now, the term migrant actually is getting much broader, and there are lots of types of migrants. It's no longer the person who crosses from one place to the other and stays there and settles in enclaves communities, like Irish people in Boston in the 19th century, or Italians whom I've been looking at in Dublin in the mid-20th century. It's more complex than that. We have cultural migrants, we have economic migrants, we have asylum-seeking migrants. There's lots of stuff going on. And what's the best way to understand migration? Well, I think for us, language is an extremely powerful lens with which to interrogate the experience and to capture the complexity of it, because this complexity involves history, society, and identity. Language practices can index the trajectory of those negotiating their constantly changing identities. Speakers use language to index and also even to create identities, including their own history, aspirations for the future, and their children's futures. And this process is dynamic and constantly evolving, even from interaction to interaction. So we can't, I think, in my view, we can't start out with a priori essentialist categories before we even start. I think we have to be with the experience. We have to be with that changing moment-to-moment interaction. If we're really going to avoid this native speakerism that we were talking about earlier and that Ortega and others mention. So people are constantly engaged in the process of identity construction. And this isn't just the case of migrants. Lots and lots of people, we all do it. We're finding a place for ourselves in the social world. We're negotiating our position in intersecting communities that they're participating in. But migrants, as using an L2 and other languages, and many of them, are even more intensely caught up in the maelstrom of different communities as they cross the borders of different types, geographical, psychological, and social. So it's quite an assault on a human being. And by the nature of the multiple worlds that migrants inhabit and the fluidity of their relationships with these worlds, the process has to be managed with great subtlety, and migrants do this. An additional element for transnational speakers is that the linguistic bricolage we all engage in to construct our identities is in this case really very complex. They may use what's called by Blomert a truncated language, and they may use language forms with functions different from the ones the L1 speaker use. So paying attention to language practices then can be a really useful tool for charting these choices, providing connections between the choice in language elements and identity, as well as migrants' aspirations. So in this context, within variationist sociolinguistics, which, as Aisling pointed out, is the approach that I normally use, within variationist sociolinguistics, an increasingly ethnographic and emergentist approach is being used, and I think is producing work that's really interesting. And I have to say immediately that this is nothing new, actually, for variationists. Bill Above, Gillian Sankoff come from a really, really strong anthropological tradition. And this has been taken up and widened out by Penny Eckert and people like Penny. But it's not a new thing. And sometimes it sounds like people think, oh, now we're going to do ethnography on the top of data and quantitative analysis. That's really not the case. But I do feel that when you've got very strong quantitative data, it can be a really nice basis for just the catalyst which says to you, now take a look at those figures and see what they might mean, because it's not always obvious if you just mechanistically look down your columns. So I think this is what I'd like to do today. I'd like to take as a basis some quantitative analysis I've done, and which, by the way, I've published in an article which has just come out this year, and I'll be putting the reference up there. And if people are interested in the quantitative and the detail of the quantitative analysis, you can get the publication, and I'll be more than happy to communicate by email with, if you wish to ask me anything about it. But I will home in on some parts of these figures, because I'd like to actually explore qualitatively what they might mean. So language variation, and thank you, Aisling, for a really nice description of what variationists do, because actually I couldn't have put it more clearly, more cogently than you've done. So thank you for that. It's intimately bound up with the choices that we make. How do we choose language elements? Do we say this or this? And what makes us make those choices? Depending on people's attitudes to language and their connections, they might choose to use the elements of language differently for more traditional speakers of the same language. And that's where I think variationist work has contributed in the last 30, 40 years to SLA, which is used to be a very separate field, but due to various researchers has been brought together, I think, with great benefit to both fields, in fact. Now, my speakers were a subset of a larger group of participants in a wider study, which I did on about Polish migrants. And again, as Aisling averted to, they were people who migrated to France and also to Ireland, and they were the same L1 but different contexts. So that was interesting in and of itself. We chose both urban and non-urban setting just to avoid the focus on urban only, which it tends to be a feature of studies of migration, understandably, due to the fact that a lot of migrants do come to big urban centres, but this is actually changing slightly. We had different generations of migrants. Some were long-term migrants in France and Ireland, and some were recent arrivals in both countries. And again, I'll have put several publications on the slide at the end. We had a multi-site design, and we included the generations, and for this reason, we were able, I think, to address in horizontal as well as vertical layers, chronological as well as spatial perspectives, the complexity of migration, and particularly this in relation to one particular migrant diaspora, the Polish one. The participants emigrated to France during 3 different migration waves, one after the Second World War. The second was what we call the Solidarity between 1980 and 1990, and the more recent migration wave. So the study that I'm going to describe today is a kind of mini version, it's a mini subset of that larger study. And I wanted to describe their language practices in France and what these indicated about their experience. In the first instance, the study focuses on their variation patterns, and especially their use of one particular variable, which in French it's the deletion of the first part of negation. And in a second phase, I wanted to explore the wider, deeper implications of the quantitative results, and I used a qualitative approach to more fully account for some aspects of the quantitative data. Okay, a couple of very brief words about Polish migration to France. Well, Polish migration to France has been going on for absolutely ever, at least 200 years. They've been migrating to France in great numbers, and in fact, it's only in the United States that you get greater numbers of Polish people. Normally, it's divided into two main periods. The first was after the war, the Second World War, and the second was and after the war, people came to work in the mining districts in Alsace and also in northern France. So there were two main centers in France where you see a lot of Polish people. The motivation was economic, as it often is. Employment was in mining and agriculture. Now, this study deals with the second, the post-1980 migration, which itself consists of two subphases, before 1989 and afterwards. The before one, between 80 and 89, is called Solidarishi Migration. A lot of people left Poland after martial law when the communist government, which was then in power, enabled one-way border crossing. So the migrants who came to France before 1989 usually intended to settle there permanently. After the collapse of the Iron Curtain in 1989, the migrants to France intended to stay for a short period only. And I'm talking about their intentions because that can actually affect how their language use changes and how their views of language can change. Now, the ones who intended to stay only for a little while didn't always do that. A lot of them went back, where a lot of them did actually stay. And that was the case of the two couples I'm going to be telling you about. There were two couples who emerged from the data as having interesting figures. Each of these couples were from one of the two research sites. So Paris was one, and there was a city in the northern provinces, which was the other one. The second town was one of those northern mining regions where people from Poland had settled in the 19th century in a chain migration pattern. The participants in the wider study, they emigrated from France. So we had people from kind of the 1960s to 1995. Their length of residence ranged from 15 to 40 years at the time of the interview. Their ages ranged from 40 to 70, and they worked in a range of different occupations. Now, they were largely naturalistic learners, and they practically little or no formal classroom teaching. Some of them went to the odd language class, but it was really, they were people who had no French coming to France, basically. Now, when we started doing the Irish Research Council project, our aim was to look at language as an indicator of integration. Now, obviously, I'm not saying that integration is this big aim of anybody who migrates from one country to another, obviously not. But it's frequently seen as a goal by government agencies and the education system of many of the receiving countries to which people go. Sociology literature frequently cites language as one of the more important indicators of integration. Thanks, Aisling, very much. The acquisition of use of the L2 can be seen as an instrument for gauging degrees of integration and/or inclusion, the stances of the speakers in relation to integration, and so a fully picture. There's obviously no simple relationship between language use and practices and integration, and it's complex, and we need to really tune in to what's happening on the ground. Methodology. Again, the methodology is the classic Lebovian methodology, which I know will be familiar to many people here and is described in many of the publications that will be on my reading list. But briefly to say, there are semi-structured interviews, which are really chats. Behind the chats were a number of modules where we, as interviewers, were vaguely aware of the topics what we wish to talk about. However, if people wanted to talk about stuff, we didn't head them off, and we certainly didn't interrupt them, and we did listen, and we tried to tune into what they were saying. So they talked about their life in Poland, their migration, the experience. The older people talked about the war. Many of them talked about leaving Poland, their friends. The interactions lasted at least 2 hours, more in some cases, because we spent such a lot of time with these people that we ended up being extremely friendly with them. We ate meals with them. They very often invited us into their homes, and we made lunch with them. And we were deeply grateful to these participants who are anonymous, and I can't thank them except anonymously for sharing their lives with us. The interviews were two-part. My Polish colleague had an interview in Polish, which was really a sort of biographical data searching thing. So she talked to them first, and then both of us talked to them in both Polish and French afterwards. Both sets of interviews were analysed, the data was integrated into, so that we gathered up the whole thing for the final analysis. We transcribed it, we coded it, and we shoved it into a computer program, which, again, variationists will know about. It's a multifactorial analysis, and it's, the program is a specialized application of logistic regression. And it shows the relative contribution of different factors to what people were doing. What was our variable? What were we looking at? Well, we were looking at migration, of course, but the patterns that we were using to chart this was the variation pattern in relation to one particular variable in French. And it's one of those ones that people do to death, and anybody speaking French will say, oh, not no deletion again. But it's one of those things that really shows a lot. So it's a handy little one. And it shows stuff like power, solidarity, aligning with people. It shows a register. And it's one of those stable things that's been in French since the Middle Ages. It's very stable today, so people really delete at very high levels of deletion. But they still retain it at some points, and it's where they retain it that's interesting. And the guys that we looked at in detail were actually people who retained, we think, consciously or unconsciously, but they needed to do this. No, there are two parts to negation in French, one before the verb, one after the verb, and you frequently drop the bit before if you want to be casual and not formal. If you want to be formal, you keep the two bits. So you have a formal and an informal variant. So based on research on the first language and also on the second language, there are many people who've worked on no deletion in relation to French native speakers. And we've done, various people, Jean-Marc Deval has worked on it, I have, Sankoff and Vincent have worked on how people who are using French as a second language deal with this. So we based our hypotheses on what would affect these deletion rates. And I'm going to show you on 3 different slides, which isn't the easiest to follow, but you can see it as a list of the factors which we hypothesized would constrain the variation, i.e. affect what they did. So I hope it's big enough to read. Again, the detail of this is available in the various publications, but I hope that people can see that these were the things we felt would actually affect what they did. So that really gives you examples of it, and also examples from their own speech. And what's in brackets there is where they could have put in a, but they didn't. Okay, so on the results, we ran the computer program. We saw the amounts of deletion that people did. The detail of this is available, as I said. So I should say just briefly that in relation to variationist research, what it does is it does detailed analyses of naturally occurring speech to account for patterns. So we're looking for patterns here. Variationists are concerned not only with what's possible and not possible, but what's likely and unlikely, and in what proportions. So it's a probabilistic approach. It correlates social forms with linguistic forms with social factors, and it tries to account for both. Modeling variation in speech takes as given the fact that multiple factors contribute to the variation. And those are the multiple factors that we felt might do it. So if the weights, eventually you get factor weights as results. If the weights are between 5 and 1, it indicates the factor favors the thing appearing. And if the weights are between 0 and 5, it indicates the factor disfavors the use of the variant. Now, so what did we find broadly? We found that the Polish speakers have an 81% deletion rate. Why is this interesting? It's interesting because it's what L1 speakers of French do. And not alone that, but on the whole, the constraint ordering was similar to native speakers, i.e., if more women than men do it in native speaker French, then the same thing happened with the Polish speakers. More women than men did it. And that was the same for all of the factors, or by and large. Now, while the constraint hierarchies were similar, on the other hand, the rates are variable according to individual speakers. And this will come as no surprise to any of you doing work on second language acquisition, individual variation is absolutely to be expected. The analysis demonstrates that the same factors, as well as the social factors, constrained the data in the French L1 and L2 at all levels, phonological, syntactic, verb type, and social. So we can conclude that they're by and large similar. But what about the individual variation? So having taken as axiomatic really that individual variation is a given, often individual variation follows group patterns anyway. However, sometimes when you do qualitative investigation of the data relating to individual speakers, we find that some of them don't follow group patterns, and they might seem anomalous. And I've been finding that those are really interesting areas to further explore. And they can be very revealing and enriching. And this is exactly what happens in relation to this group. When we examined, actually this was post our major project, and on a closer examination, which I did myself, I found that some results were surprising in relation to two couples. And I looked at two couples' figures, and what I found was that they spent a lot of time talking about language. Now, you might say, well, yeah, why not? They're migrants, they're in another country, they're learning a new language. Sure. However, this wasn't something that we as interviewers had asked them about. We weren't showing any interest in it. And yet the people seemed to be coming back time and again in a very insistent way, talking about language, how they felt about it, how their kids were, how they were learning, what was the school experience, what was the education experience. And what they said seemed to reveal a lot about their language attitudes and their attitudes to the wider ideology of France in relation to French. So what was their story? So we have the two couples I homed in on and the figures relating to them here. So these are probability figures, by the way, not percentages. So the probability of their deleting ne is what we're seeing here, i.e. what was the probability of their using the informal variant. So you can see that the first two are very similar to each other, the second two not. These two couples, Gabi and Henri, and Elena and Danielle, were very similar in many ways. Gabi and Henri lived in Paris. Gabi was 55, and Henri was similar age. The second group, Elena and Danielle, lived in the northern city, and also they were similar in age. They'd all arrived in France roughly at the same time. They'd spent similar amounts of time in France. They both had one child, a daughter in both cases. Both daughters were integrated into the French education system. Both couples intended to stay in France. Both had good jobs and incomes by now, and they had a better life economically than they would have had in Poland. One couple deleted at a rate similar to each other. They were like each other. So Elena's factor weight was 0.26, Daniel was 0.233, so basically the same. The other couple were very different. Gabi's was 0.2, like the other two, but Henri's was 0.7. I'm thinking, you know, that's very funny. Both couples were very similar. They had similar life experiences, aims, ambitions, kids, everything. Why was this? So, as I said, the qualitative analysis was something then that I carried out in a second phase. The first couple. So, these were particularly intriguing. They had very similar life trajectories to each other. They needed to... Okay, so let me just finish by saying that they, in their talk about language, they indicated that they had made every effort to learn French, and their children had made every effort to learn French. They talked about having left, for instance, their children in school at a time when the French children were there, so that they would be able to learn French more and to deal more closely with French speakers. So they had done everything to encourage the children to fit in. They said, we can't fit in, but our kids can. So we found that the amount of time they spent talking about language, as well as the actions that they took, i.e. sending the kids to school, making the kids learn. They talked about, they also had a discourse of correct French. They talked about elle fait pas de faute, elle a un français correct. And they also talked about people who wouldn't get in touch with French people, Polish people who dealt with other Polish people. And they had a very prescriptive discourse around the Polish language as well as the French language. So what I concluded from it was that they used the sort of discourse that they would have used for the Polish language in relation to the French language to de-dramatize the transition. Now, you could say that perhaps the difference in the two couples was due to gender. In that case, why was the second couple not the same? Because what transpired was that the man who had a very high use of the informal variant was a man who wasn't a bit interested in education or the detail of his daughter's trajectory through the education system. He was far more interested in everything outside France. So what I had to conclude was, instead of saying, well, that's a gender issue, and even if I took that sort of gendered approach to language and said, okay, it's because he's male, he's not interested in his kids. which would have been a big supposition in any case, what I had to conclude was that it wasn't a matter of gender, it was a matter rather of their complete focus on language ideologies and what it could do for them as migrants trying to fit into France. And I don't have time to talk about the Irish learners, but just to say that the French people who wanted the French kids to fit in made them speak correct French, i.e. they didn't use the informal variants. But the Irish Poles who wanted their children to fit in Ireland were very happy for them to use the informal variant, and in this case we were looking at the fact that in Ireland they used the more local rather than the global, and the more local was the informal one. So in rather too hasty a conclusion, I hope that I've managed to convey the fact that in two different contexts, people with the same L1 seem to have adapted to the language ideology of the country they were in, France on the one hand, with a very codified language system. And Irish on the other hand, where Irish English is seen as a kind of variety anyway, and people in Ireland seem to possibly be less prescriptive in their use of what's called standard language. And it seemed that the migrants were very subtly and intelligently getting the appropriate attitude, appropriation, understanding of what they needed to do. They weren't adopting the attitudes and ideologies wholesale. They were rearranging them, reimagining them, and using them probably for the needs of their own lives right now and into the future. And thank you so much for your patience.
So if we have any questions, please come up and line up, and we're open for questions.
I should say I apologize for going over the time. Everybody needs both lunch and to travel. And I'm absolutely delighted to answer any questions via email.
Hi, Vera. Thank you for a really fascinating talk. I wanted to say variationist perspectives on identity have been really, really important to my own psycholinguistic work. And I wanted to ask your perspective on how you handle or approach more complex and fluid understandings of identity within the constraints of quantitative and experimental variationist methods.
I think you're asking one of the really most important questions of the moment for variationists. And people have pointed out quite rightly that individual variation can be swallowed up in these vast figures that people's eyes glaze over when you see them. And I think that that's why we need to stop. We need to stop and look at the figures very carefully. I think Penny Eckert did a very good job for us all when she looked at the gender issues in relation to the jocks and the burnouts. And so she showed that gender wasn't male-female, it wasn't this binary thing. And she was probably the first to do that. We all take that for granted now, we're really happy, and nobody sort of says, well, you know, before that, before Penny's work, people just sort of said, okay, so sex, male, female. I think there's lots of really interesting work being done by transgender people in variation circles at the moment. There's a real effort to get in touch with the more ethnographic work, and I think it's only by using almost a grounded approach that we can actually focus on the fine grain of the interaction, and I think we need to add other types of analysis. One recent technical thing is the Arbrule approach, which has taken the individual variation and used a separate category for individual. And that's something that was a technical issue, but it got us into a straitjacket of dealing with male-female gender and other essentialist stuff. I think the recent work on identity, my own work, I think, has stepped outside of the a priori categories. I think I've tried to delve a little bit, and there are many young researchers in variation conferences these days that I'm hearing are addressing the more subtle aspects. The funny thing is, you almost need the technology to go with you on these matters, and I think the sort of dichotomous straitjackets we were in the 80s and 90s are being addressed. So we need ethnographers on the one hand, we need people, gender studies people, we need classic variationists, but we need them all to come together now. And I think it's for the younger researchers to get together in groups if necessary. A multidisciplinary approach, I think, is the way to go.
Thank you.
You're very welcome.
I just wanted to ask whether you considered neurodiversity in Henri, only because I'm married to a Pole, and he's the most brilliant speaker of English, and he's absolutely brilliant with our daughters. The problem is, when it comes to reading and writing, that's not his thing. So, despite being one of the most intelligent people I know, he'll be brilliant at speaking, but then he'll leave the kids for the reading and writing. You know, he doesn't get involved in any of that. So maybe Henri had something that kept him from.
Thank you so much for that. I think neurodiversity is one of the most important issues at the moment, mainly because we've now finally addressed the grief, the loss, the pain of all of those children who've grown up without help, without support, without the respect for their particular profile. We've lost so much talent, so much creativity, and I think it's people like you who are going to deal with this. And I think in relation to the previous question, I think it's just that sort of multidisciplinary approach to be brought together with a more technical approach, so that we don't do things like make binary distinctions on gender or multiple neuro profiles, which, because of advances in PET scans, CAT scans, and the sort of brain stuff that people are doing such exciting work on, we're going to be able to bring these brain people, I think, into the sort of research that'll be cutting edge in the next 10 years. So thank you for raising that. I think it's really super important.
Okay. Thank you very, very much, Professor Regan, for a wonderful and inspiring talk, and thank you for sharing your work with us. We really appreciate it. I would invite colleagues to give a final round of applause.